Hey, everybody. Welcome. Aloha. I'm Natalie, and this is Life After a Cult, the channel where we expose cult nonsense. We laugh at the absurdities, and we hopefully unbrainwash ourselves in the process. Have you ever wondered why celebrities like Tom Cruise, John Travolta, or even Aaron Cairo stay in Scientology despite all the scandals, lawsuits, and bad press? Is it loyalty or is it something darker? Today, we are going to sit down and chat with former Scientologist, author, cult expert, author of many, many books, John Atack, and we are going to expose the hidden forces that keep high profile members trapped inside. And let's be honest, that actually applies to everybody. From blackmail to psychological control. I think the truth might just shock some people. Welcome, John.
So good to be back again. How are you doing, Natalie?
I am doing good, and I am just dying to dig into some of this. I've been talking a lot this week about some high-profile Scientologists, and it kind of started the conversation of why is it so hard to leave Scientology? I thought about my own story and what it took for me to leave, the decision, and then what it physically took. I had a 2-year plan. I didn't know it would take 2 years, but that's what it took. Then there's other people who don't leave, and I don't fully understand the difference. And I was hoping, as our resident cult expert, you could help shed some light. And just for people who might be new, John Atack, like I said, is a former Scientologist. Here is his channel here on YouTube, John Atack Family and Friends. I've got it linked down below. I've also got linked down below where you can find all of his books. In fact, I'm just going to pull up your website here so people can see here. This is linked down below, but if you go to johnatack.co.uk, you can find out a ton about John, all of his socials, and you can also find where to buy his books. So which one is it? Is it this one? Oh, here, books. You click on that, and it takes you to all of the books that John Atack has written, and there's quite a bit. So what do you think, John? What are your first thoughts? Oh, you know what? I'm so sorry, chat. I forgot to say hello to you. Hello, moderators. I see you, Marcy and Northern Girl. Thank you so much for being here and helping out. And members, I see you there too, and everybody else in the live chat. If you have a question, could you put question in front of it? And then I will keep an eye on those, and we'll try to get as many as we can. No one, it's so great to see you here. Bob, I see you there. Oh, we got Bina here as well. Okay, so now, John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been doing. I left Scientology in 1983. Okay, and I trained as an auditor. I'm OT5, so I have lots of magical powers.
Yes.
And for a long time, documentary people will come to me and say, we want to make something about Scientology. And I'll say, okay, if you will take on one of these things, why do people join? Why do people stay? How do people leave? How do you recover? Any one of these 4 things. And just about every documentary team I've talked with in the last 10 years has said, oh, no, we're not doing that. We want to show abuse, and we want to show how people are screwed up. And I'm sort of, okay, not doing it. Unless, of course, you offer me a lot of money, and they never do for some reason. But cheapskates. So the first part is recruitment, and we talked about that before. And the second part is, why do we stay? I was in Scientology for 9 years, and I was 19 when I got involved. I was just incredibly lucky that I never joined staff. I was asked to start a celebrity center, and I got close to doing that, and didn't. And of course, you're asked every week to join the staff in Copenhagen, in LA, in Seattle, wherever you like, and there's all these things. And somehow I kind of went, no, I want to get the training as fast as possible. And so, I'll go down to St. Hill, and I'll do all of these courses. And along the way, I found Hubbard saying, that the most important people in the world are artists. The artist injects the theta into the culture, which is the good stuff, the theta, apparently. And So whenever the recruiter was coming to me after that, I'd say, no, I'm an artist. So I skived off. I went to art college for 2 years when I was meant to be being serious. And that was a protection which I only understood later. So if we're talking about Tom Cruise, John Travolta, Priscilla Presley, Giovanni Ribisi, Chick Corea, the late great Chick Corea, so many, Lee Konitz, the amazing alto sax player, so many people, NASA physicists, all sorts of people have got involved in Scientology and then stayed. And Hubbard was very careful about his celebrity policy. Janice Gillum Grady's mum, Yvonne Gillum, who everybody I've talked to in the US said she was one of the most wonderful people they ever met. She was sort of the polar opposite of Ron Hubbard. That Ron Hubbard really liked screaming at people and putting them down, that, you know, throwing them overboard and sticking them in chain lockers and punishing people. You know, everybody's got their thing, right? You know, and that's what
everybody's got their kink.
Yeah, and he got plenty of them. She, on the other hand, was thoroughly nice and decent. Something else that you empaths that you meet in Scientology is lovely people. And so she set up.
She started Celebrity Center, right?
Yeah, she set up the first Celebrity Center in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And you started getting this filtration process. These people would not be treated in the same way as others. So that's the first part of it. And because, even though I wasn't making any money at it, because I was an artist, a writer, a musician, I was always treated as a celebrity. And so, you know, apart from a couple of drastically long sales sessions, I did 13 hours at one time without food with this money lender called Lee Lawrence waving a check at me to buy, you know, OT 6 and 7 and all of this and saying, look, you know, you can have this and it's only going to cost you 30% a year. And
for
you know,
loan?
Yeah, 30% a year. Yeah, it was one of my delights in life. I shouldn't admit this. I don't want this to sound unpleasant, but people would come to me after I left and say, oh, I borrowed this money from Lee Lawrence. What do I do about that? And I'd say, you don't pay him back. It's not a legal contract.
Was this a Scientologist who was lending money to other Scientologists?
Yeah,
like
he was he was a loan shark. He was an aged Scientologist, and he found this great way of making money. So I hope I put a little bit of a crimp in his sale somewhere along the way there. But so that was as bad as it got, you know. And after I left, I had about a year. I had people all over me wanting help and, you know, get themselves back to life again. And I was sort of, I heard all these horrible stories, I'd never heard about these rice and beans diets. I didn't know about the Rehabilitation Project Force, the kind of slave labor force. And I realized that I'd been protected from all of that, but also that I wasn't meeting anybody who hadn't been traumatized in some way and abused in some way. So there's part one, the idea of trauma bonding, that for the non-celebrity, that perversely, if somebody traumatizes you and you let it happen, they have more power and control over you. And Scientology is very traumatic.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. There's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of bullying so that you can achieve serenity of beingness, or tone 40 as it's called.
That is really crazy. Just that one piece there. I think about that sometimes today and I'm like, wow. So the whole goal was to be exterior, to have serenity of beingness. Yet, especially in the Sea organization, it's like nonstop getting in your face, threatening you. Anytime you don't do what your seniors, or even as a public person in Scientology, they don't want you to do, you know, it's just, they just come at you full blown. So yeah, I hear you, John.
And that wonderful contradiction that this is called tone 40, that when somebody screams their head off at you, this is tone 40, which of course is tone 40 on the tone scale, serenity of beingness. And this is expressed through screaming. And that never really made any sense to me. We mentioned Charles Manson before we invited the people in, because one of the things I'm working on is a book about Charles Manson. And Manson used tone 40. When he was asked how he'd managed to silence a room full of people at a club, whole room, with just one yell, he said it was tone 40. And when one of his devotees asked him, so what's tone 40? He said, oh, it's something they use in the military.
Oh, that's funny. So he didn't credit Scientology with it.
No.
Yeah, and for people who might not know, tone 40 it's on L. Hubbard's emotional tone scale, and the emotions have numbers, and this is tone 40. So it's like number 40 in a way, but you're supposed to be able to, and it was contradictory, because how are you supposed to impinge yet it's serenity of beingness? If you truly are in a place of serenity and comfortable with who you are and just in your space, why are you trying to impinge on other people? And you're right, John, in Scientology, that was always used as a justification to justify all the yelling and threatening that went on. So you're saying, well, tell us just how involved in Scientology was Charles Manson? Because I'm fascinated by the idea that even Charles Manson left Scientology, but a lot of other people have not. Or it took me, granted I was growing up, but still, I was 40 years old when I left Scientology. Yet Charles Manson figured it out before I did. Now, granted, I was practically born into it, and I had multiple generations of my family in it. But can you fill us in on what is the story? What is the truth about Charles Manson and his involvement in Scientology?
He was in prison, and there was a Scientologist called Lania Raymer, which is a funny name, but that's what he was called, Lania Raymer. And he had done forgive me, he'd done what was called the Hubbard professional auditing course, and in San Diego, he'd been certified at the Los Angeles organization back in, I think, 1959, 58, 59.
Charles Manson.
No, Lania Raymer.
Lania Raymer.
This is the guy who would give the truth of the tech to Charles Manson. And Raymer, sort of realizing that Scientology was rather expensive and wanting to do some more, thought, how do you make money quickly? And so he hit on a get-rich-quick system, which was, what's the quickest way of making money? Robbing banks. So he robbed 2 banks in the same day, and he got caught for both. So he wasn't able to go up the bridge any further. But he had, this professional auditor qualification back then was, this was the thing. You were. This is before OT levels and any of this stuff. So he finds himself in prison, and he recruits a group of 10 people, 10 fellow prisoners, including his cellmate Charles Manson. And Manson is, where are we? This is 1960. So Manson's already spent most of his life in institutions from the age of 12. And he's coming up 30. And he, in his autobiography, which he later denied, but he spent 9 years writing it, Manson says he got pretty heavily involved in Dianetics and Scientology. So that's what he says. Now, when the FBI performed the largest raid in their history on the Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles Scientology organizations in July 1977, they got what is called a red box. And the red boxes were the contents were to be destroyed if there was a raid. And the Guardian's office let them get the red boxes. And one of the red boxes had the Manson documents in it, and I have them. And by the time the Manson killings started in July 1969, went on through August.
And just so I'm clear on this, Manson was in prison, got into Scientology, but this was before the Manson family murders?
Yes, he comes out of prison in 1967, having spent 10 years in prison, and not his first sentence. And while in prison, so the source for my information, it's just to say this isn't something I read in the comic books. This is Scientology's own file on Manson that I have. And they knew that he'd done Scientology. And so they set about changing the story, creating a shore story, as they call it, to suggest that the reason he knew Scientology was because he'd been involved with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was a fairly lightweight splinter group from Scientology. All sorts of allegations about them sacrificing animals and things like this have come up. A guy called Maury Terry wrote a book called The Ultimate Evil, in which he said that David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was a member of the Process Church. It's nonsense. They were just a bunch of silly people, and had nothing to do with Manson. There are other people who did, but nonetheless.
So that was purely being said so that there wouldn't be as much of a tie to Scientology.
Yeah.
So when Charles Manson was in prison studying Scientology, did Scientology know about it then? Is that why they started these red files? Do you know how they found out?
No, the red box was after he was arrested. He's arrested at the beginning of December 1969. And Scientology scramble because there's immediately a piece saying that he's involved with Scientology. And so they do a full investigation. They find Lania Raymer. They find out exactly what he did. So the information I'm going to give about the Scientology that he did comes from Scientology's own files. This is not gossip. So he was involved for 14 months. And he had 150 auditing sessions in that time, which is more than I had to get to OT5.
So Charles Manson had more Scientology auditing than you did.
Yeah. And at the end of that period, and it gets confusing. I read 14 books, 5 of them by ex-members of the family, and nobody says this. None of the biographers goes, the most important thing to know about Charles Manson is that he trained in Scientology and he used the techniques to control people. There you go. That's the most important thing about Charles Manson. Scientology knew this. And they created what they called Operation Rawhide.
Rawhide?
Rawhide.
Rawhide. Rawhide.
There's a certain comedy to that, which is quite accidental, which is at Spahn's Movie Ranch, where Manson's group lived most of the time, was actually where Rawhide with Clint Eastwood was filmed. So there you go. I don't think Scientology knew that. I think it was just one of those incredible psychic things, But so he, reading all of this stuff and going through it, what I discovered was that I know exactly what Scientology processes were used on him, because I found the course that Lania Raymer did in 1958. So I know that it was as a consequence of Scientology that Charles Manson came to believe that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Do you think this is because in Scientology auditing, because you go earlier, similar, so you can go back to earlier lifetimes and identify as somebody in the past, and a Scientology auditor will never tell you that's wrong. So if I'm tracking with you, Charles Manson is in prison. His prison bunkmate turns out to be a Scientologist who landed himself in prison. This then prison Scientologist audits Charles Manson, who ends up getting more auditing than you. And throughout the auditing, Charles Manson realizes that, oh my gosh, I'm Jesus Christ.
Well, it's very specific, and the day it happened, I pulled this material together. You have to go all over the place, but I pulled this material together. I found the specific process, which I think is the one that did it. It's not one that was used during my training. It had dropped out. Bearing in mind that there are like 2,000 auditing processes now, but there have been about 10,000 over the years, because it doesn't work. So you have to keep thinking of something else and saying, "Oh, this will get you clear. This will get you exterior. This will get your intention to the point where, you can intend that John Atack's voice will never be heard again. And it will never be heard again because all of the OTs have just, oh, but here we are. It's not working, is it? Scientology doesn't really work. Oh dear. So what happened is he's run on this process, and we're not going to do this. And I recommend you don't try this at home. This is an actual L. Ron Hubbard Scientology process that was part of the training that Laney Raymer did. And the question is, remember a life as a famous person.
Is that standard? Is that a standard Scientology auditing question?
It was then.
It was.
I found the questions list, the Hubbard published questions list, and there is that question. And you're going, so we're going to, everybody's going to come. You know, I took with Karen de la Carrière a couple of years ago, and we started talking about Jesus and how many people thought they'd been Jesus, or you know, this kind of thing. And she said when she was running things at the Flag Land Base in Florida, she was aware of 200 people who had said they were Jesus. So,
wow.
And it's fine. They're probably just Jesus's body thetans at some point, you know, so there's a rational explanation for it.
Yeah. Scientology always has an explanation for it. And in Scientology auditing, the auditor in Scientology will never tell somebody, no, that's not true. You were not that person. They will tell you all kinds of other things. But if you in a Scientology auditing session say, I was Jesus, I was whoever, they will just say, okay.
Yeah. So and Manson at least twice reenacted the crucifixion in front of his followers with him on the cross. He gave them LSD first, which is not very nice, I don't think. It's a little bit of a bad trip, Charlie. And so, and he told them, it's my name, man, son of man, I'm Jesus. He had them read out the book of Revelation to him. All of these books about Charles Manson, there have been more than 50 books about him. They don't get anywhere close to what actually happened. He learned Scientology. He applied Scientology. And as L. Ron Hubbard says, Scientology leads to success in any walk of life. So if you want to lead a serial killing gang, study Scientology, if that's your intention, because that's where it went. And he used Scientology processes. Nobody has ever commented on this. They're described in some of the books. You've got him using something which we go, well, that's space hand mimicry that he's doing there, or that's whatever. He uses all sorts of tricks. It's not to say, you know, he's not standard in his use. He absorbs these things and he adds to them his previous skills as a pimp, as a thief, as an armed robber, and adds them into the morality that he already had, and creates this situation. And you even have authors who say, oh, he did Dale Carnegie's course and how to win friends and influence people. And it's like, well, yeah, he did that. It is true. He did start that course in prison and dropped out of it. But he read everything by Hubbard that he could manage, bearing in mind he was semi-literate, and he learned everything he could. And then at the end of it, I shouldn't be explaining this. I shouldn't be saying this because these are big scoop secrets that nobody in the world knows. But repeatedly, authors say that he attested to the state of clear. No, he didn't. He attested to the state of theta clear. And if you are an expert in any way on Scientology, this is something, it disappeared. Theta clear is something was not really heard of again after the 1970s.
Tell me if I'm wrong. Wasn't a theta clear a believed to be somebody who was always clear? They just never had a reactive mind.
That's a natural clear.
That's a natural clear.
Yeah, which I was told was my situation, that I'd never actually had a reactive mind. So give me my money back, you know. So, come on, guys. But a theta clear, it starts in 1952. This is the objective of Scientology. He would later rename it an operating theta, and it's only fully defined in the old OT8 release, which says that you will be at cause over both mental and physical matter, energy, space, and time, which is to say you'll not only have the clear state, which is control over your mind, you'll also be able to make planets blow up, make Hershey bars appear, out of nothing. And who wants to eat Hershey bars anyway, frankly? And you want the better quality chocolate than that if you're going to be.
Exactly.
But
Some nice
theta
dark
clear, nice dark chocolate, single vintage dark chocolate. That's what we want. 85% at least. But you can make that just, you can have baths full of it once you're an OT. The theta clear is the original 1952 state where you will be stably exterior from your body, that's what the definition of an operating thetan is. It's a thetan that can operate outside the body. And I think that's a misunderstood that many Scientologists have, that they no longer know what these simple words like squirrel actually mean. So that's why their Scientology is not working, because they've got misunderstood words, or MUs, as the so it's a Buddhist, Japanese Buddhist term, MU, meaning nothing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Isn't it? It's weird. I mean, mest is the Dutch word for shit. It's really interesting how words move between languages. But there we go. Oh, the mest universe. Oh yeah, we've been there.
So Charles Manson gets out of jail. At some point, Scientology panics because they know he'd been studying Scientology. They know he'd been getting tons of auditing. They create files about this, and you said it was called the Red Box, what was supposed to be destroyed in case they were ever investigated or raided.
Yeah, and the documents in the Red Box tell us about Laney Raymer. They tell us how much auditing he had over the period of 14 months. And where authors have become confused is that in 1961, still in prison, he's still got 6 years to go, Manson freaks out and he says, I don't want to do any more of this.
Yeah.
Now, the reason he freaks out is that he's finished it. He's done everything. He's now stably exterior. That's what he believes.
Yeah.
Now, there is a psychiatric term for this, oddly enough, called
what is
depersonalization, where people think they're outside their bodies. And yeah, the test of it, and I asked hundreds of people after I left Scientology, of course you do, have you ever been exterior? And people say, well, yeah, I had this feeling that I was kind of, yeah, but could you perceive from the outside? I met two people who said they could.
Yeah.
One of them said she did it as a child before she got into Scientology and was never able to do it again. And the other was Otto Rose, who actually did the original OT8 course, which I'm sorry to say to anybody who's paid the $250,000 for the new OT8 course, isn't what you're being sold now. The original OT8 course has nothing to do with what's that. I'm sorry about that. But Otto did that, and he told me and he was Ron Hubbard's auditor, and he was one of only 5 people trained to class 12 by Hubbard. So he's as high as you get before Hubbard threw him out for telling Hubbard he got 200 rock slams in his folders and they indicated evil purposes, which they probably did in Hubbard's case. He said he'd been exterior once and had perception, and then he ruined it because he told me that he'd seen the Apollo, the ship, split in half while he was exterior. And you're going, no, it's got to be perceiving things that are really happening for it to be true.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So Charles Manson believes that he is stably exterior while he's in prison because of his Scientology auditing.
Yeah.
Tell us more about what happened then when he left and the role that Scientology played and what he went on to do. Like you said that he used it to control people.
Yeah. So he used it to recruit people and control them. And the first thing he did when he got out of prison, and he did say at the gate as they were letting him out, can't I just stay? I don't want to leave. If only they'd listened to him, because from the age of 12, he'd spent nearly all of his time in prison, and he's what now, 32 or something when he gets out. And the first thing he does he goes to San Francisco, and he goes to the Scientology organization. And this is not in the record anywhere. This is not, well, it's in the record, but it's not in any of the books. And he asks them, about what's going on, and then he wanders off and starts his recruiting. So he will recruit a series of people, one after the other, and he uses a variety of Scientology processes, control communication havingness or objective processes, to actually bring them. What happens in these processes is what hypnotists call pacing. So a standard method, and I've never trained in hypnotism. I never wanted to. I wanted to know after leaving Scientology, I wanted to know what I'd been doing to people. I didn't want to learn how to do more of it. I wanted to make sure I didn't do it to people
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's controlling and horrible. And controlling somebody without their consent is evil. I don't care whether you call it black magic or white magic or green magic, it's evil. People should know what's happening and should participate in their own destiny, their own fate. So that was a little bit of a separation for me from the ideas of Scientology. So I studied hypnotism from the outside to understand what was happening, and was devastated to find that almost every Scientology procedure is a standard form of hypnotic induction, a way of bringing about an altered state of mind. So with pacing, if you sit with somebody and you breathe at the same rate they're breathing, then you can actually then start to suggest something to them that they will do. And there are all sorts of examples of pacing in the Dead Poets Society, the great film with Robin Williams in. He has them, the kids march around the courtyard and they see that they fall into step. They start marching together. That's pacing. That's something that is absolutely physiological and fundamental. So when you do objective processes, look at that wall, walk over to that wall, pick up the bottle, put your hand against mine, contribute to the motion, you're actually being paced. You're being paced into a relationship with the auditor. And what will happen as a consequence of that is a euphoric state. Very good indicators, as it's called in Scientology. He had to mess up the language. Euphoria is such a nice word. Very good indicators. It's so unpoetic, Ron. So he's actually, all of your processes, it's the normal thing that a hypnotherapist expects. You get to a relaxed, euphoric state. Very good indicators, floating needle. This indicates that you are in what Hubbard originally called a reverie state.
Yes.
And again, in terms of looking words up, I please, anybody that's read Dianetics, the Mental Science of Modern Health, should look up the word reverie and understand that in 1950, it meant light trance. It is a trance state, the reverie that he's trying to induce. And he talks about that in 1951 in Science of Survival. He says you mustn't use that method because it induces a trance, which is reverie. Now, that reverie is a normal thing. Hey, I feel great. I feel high. I feel wonderful. I want some more of that, you know?
Yeah.
There are cheaper ways than auditing of getting high, and safer ways as well. So what Manson does is he uses a simple set of Scientology type procedures. He did reward systems, which is again something that you'll find in animal training, where when the pet does what you want, you give them a sweet. And he would always carry a pocket of, I think they were called Zuzus. It's not a sweet that we have here. And if somebody did what he wanted, he'd give them a sweet. And you've got these, he's looked at hypnotism, he's looked at Scientology, and he's found out these ways. And people talk about him, that there was something about him. He was what, 5 foot? He's 5'3". It's a little guy.
That's incredibly. He was that short stature.
Yeah. There's a picture of him in prison against one of the measures. People have tried to say that he was 5'6", but you know, I'm going with what else I've seen. Isn't it amazing how quickly a piece of information can be lost? This guy only died 5 years ago, and we don't know how tall he was anymore. But he was a little guy, and yet he could attract the attention of a whole room. People talk about when he would go to a club and dance, that everybody would be watching him. And he'd gone in, you know, with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and Terry Melcher, who was produced the Easy Rider album and produced the Byrds. These are people he's hanging out with. He hung out with Neil Young.
Wow. And he was trying to recruit for his own, would you call it a cult, his group, that what became the Manson family?
Absolutely, I would. When you look at some of the behaviors in that group, it was a highly male-dominated group, so that when they ate, the men would eat first, then the dogs would eat, then the women would eat. The women were his front of house girls and his back of house girls. I think those are the expressions that he would. Some of the women were used as prostitutes. That he would get favors from people. that's a way of trauma bonding. Again, that's a way of getting somebody under your control. He particularly picked on young women. Two of the members of the family were 15 years old.
Whoa.
And he also, I mean, Mary Brunner, the first recruit, had 2 university degrees. So this isn't about stupid. And he started out as a kind of love and peace and nature sort of guru.
Mm-hmm.
And it degenerated as he got more and more paranoid. And he brought other aspects to this, which we won't get into here because I've got to have something left to sell to a publisher. but there is a point, there's a significant point in August of 1968 where he goes into the Los Angeles organization
Mm-hmm.
and says, "Is there anything new?" And they say, "Yes. Ron's just released Operating Thetan Levels. These new things, 1, 2, and 3. They are available in Great Britain." And we know that Manson, and they're living out of dumpsters. They're getting their food out of dumpsters. But he put together the money for 3 of his people to fly to England. And they got their destination wrong. The Hubbard Association of Personal Integrity, HAPPY, was in Edinburgh in Scotland. It's where David Mayo and Captain Bill and various people work. That's where OT3 was released to the public. Their guy ended up going to St. Hill. And we have the record. He worked there. We have an address for him when he flew back, and he would later commit one of the murders. So
And
we have
so Charles Manson had one of his people he recruited go to Scientology St. Hill in England with the intention of doing the upper confidential levels, but
the intention of obtaining the upper levels, I think. That was the idea. And he ended up going to the wrong organization. They caught him smoking a joint and threw him out, and he caught a plane back. One of the other guys, Joel Pugh, who went with him, ended up dead in suspicious circumstances. That seemed to happen around the Manson people. And the third person just disappeared, just into the woodwork. But so you have all of these associations with Scientology, and I'm absolutely confident that without Scientology, the Tate LaBianca murders would not have happened. It's because of that.
How do you think that Scientology made the difference in that way when it came to Charles Manson doing, putting together his family cult group and then going and, planning or executing this type of crime?
It is the essential question, isn't it? He was, as he was, and from his own descriptions of himself, he was withdrawn, shy, frightened, and then he did Scientology. And he says Scientology taught him how to control people.
Wow. Charles Manson actually said Scientology taught me how to control people.
Yeah. That it
So it
changed
sounds
him.
like he was already a criminal, and then he
Somewhat,
took Scientology, studied it in prison, and then just had a whole new way of controlling people. Wow.
Yeah. And his background had largely been controlling teenage girls into turning tricks and stealing cars. He stole a lot of cars. But he learned how to assert himself. He learned how to, bully people and take control. And it was that simple. And people who knew him before, it's just like, he's a nobody. But people, again, like Terry Melcher, Dennis Wilson, said he was just absolutely compelling. Neil Young said he also was a great songwriter, which I don't agree with. But Neil Young was a great songwriter, but there you go. But he was hanging out with the people that in Laurel Canyon and Malibu and all of this. And there are events that made things turn sour, and which is another story. But we're talking about how you retain followers. How is it that that Scientology does this. It's the same way that Charles Manson retained followers. And it's interesting, if you read the autobiographies of those of his followers who went to prison for murder, starting with Tex Watson, who led both of the La Bianca killings, and before that, the Tate killings. 7 people in all are killed over those 2 nights. That with him, with Patricia Krenwinkel, with the other Susan Atkinson, you find that about 5 years after the events, every one of them suddenly realized what they'd done. And until then,
5 years after.
Yeah, 5 years after they go to prison, they seem to spontaneously, I mean, there is some contact between them, but they seem to spontaneously realize that what they did was absolutely evil. Whereas at the time, Susan Atkins, when she is just about to kill Sharon Tate, who is 8 months pregnant, says, "Spare the baby." And she says, "I stopped and I thought about it, and then I decided not to, and then I licked the blood from the knife." They've been brought to a state of complete indifference to other human life. And I would say that that is a similar state to the Sea Organization member, that you've got to get your stats, you've got to get your job done. I'm not suggesting that any of them are murderers, but it becomes more important to fulfill the task, which is the will of David Miscavige or the will of Charles Manson, than it is to think about humanity and compassion and your own decency, which is to say you've become a psychological slave. You no longer make decisions. You no longer decide what to do. You go, what would Ron do? Or, one of these awful things. So you've submitted. You've given yourself in to a leader, which happens in military situations, of course. But, in this case, it meant that people followed the will of Charles Manson. There was a documentary called, I think, Making Manson, and I did a little 10-minute video critiquing it. The people, just a few months ago, people came to me while they were making it. And I said, "I've got all this stuff." And they said, "We don't want to pay you." And I said, "Look, come on. I've spent a year working on this. You want to take all my stuff so I won't be able to do anything with it?" No. And the reason they couldn't pay me was because they'd already paid this guy probably quite a large amount of money, who had had 18 years of recorded phone calls with Manson. And they believed the stories that Manson told, which are in absolute contradiction with reality, and put out 3 hours of documentary with the fundamental idea that Manson didn't incite his followers to commit murder. And they'd even managed, the first victim at the Tate house was a young man called Stephen Parent, who was 19. And he just happened to be in the way. He'd gone to see the janitor to sell him a clock radio, and he was leaving. Tex Watson got him and killed him. His little brother, who was 13 at the time, is interviewed throughout this documentary. And they persuade him, because he says, "All I wanted to do, it ruined my family. My parents became alcoholics. Everything was destroyed with the killing of my brother. And so all I wanted to do was commit a crime so I could get into the prison where Manson was and kill him." And they managed to, which is probably not a good idea, they managed to convince him that Manson wasn't responsible. And
who convinced him?
The film crew, the documentary makers.
What?
Yeah.
Was this the documentary that was just on Netflix?
It could, yeah. I'm not sure if it's been on Netflix. I saw it was on Peacock or some channel, but yeah, 3 hours called The Making of Manson, I think. And as I say, on my channel, if you just look at Manson, I've done 3 or 4 videos about him. But there's one, just a 10-minute video where I say one point after another what they got wrong in this documentary. There's making documentaries to understand things, and there's making documentaries to make moolah.
Yeah, because like you were saying, there have been multiple books about Charles Manson, and I feel like a little bit of talk of him in Scientology, but what you're sharing and what you're bringing forward in the book you're working on too, it is a solid tie. It's not just he walked past a Scientology organization. Like you said, Charles Manson had more auditing than you did as a Scientologist. then for him to take a lot of those brainwashing and mind control techniques and use them to recruit people for the Manson family and carry out those horrific crimes. How tell me more about this red box with Scientology, because do you think it's because Scientology works so hard to cover up the tie to Scientology that not many other people who cover Charles Manson talk about it? What are your thoughts on that?
It was very immediate that the connection to Scientology was made almost immediately. He's arrested in the December. The first news article to suggest his involvement with Scientology was significant came out. Scientology threatened to sue. In fact, they sued, and they got an apology. And what you get in the red box is the admission that, yes, it was Scientology he studied, and then the Operation Rawhide, which is how to make sure that nobody finds this out. And they did such an amazing job of this, that they harassed people and sued them.
Yeah, they're good at their harassment and espionage. Yeah. So Rawhide was the project to cover up that Charles Manson was deep into Scientology.
Yeah, and 54 years later, there still isn't a reliable book, even though many, say Jeff Gwynn's book, for example, Tom O'Neill's book is just a farce. That was what got me into this. That I did a show with my friend Eric Hunley, and he said, "Oh, do you know your friend Jolly West, the psychiatrist? He kind of set up the Manson family." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Jolly's a lovely bloke. What do you mean?" And it was this Tom O'Neill book, Chaos. So I read that, and I did a show with Eric to kind of go, no, whatever Jolly may or may not have been, as Tom O'Neill says in this book, which he says took him 20 years to research, all he can prove is that they both walked the same corridors in the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. Not even that they were ever there on the same day. Yeah. And that 2.5 years later, the Manson murders happened. And I'm told that Tom O'Neill's now writing a book about Jolly West, saying that he also designed all of the 146 projects of MK Ultra, the CIA mind control program. It's just, and he brainwashed Jack Ruby after he'd killed Lee Harvey. It's just this fanciful set of stories. So there's some of that stuff around, and that's really not worth the paper it's printed on. But there are good biographers like Jeff Gwynn or Ed Sanders, who wrote one of the first books. But they don't go after the real leads because they don't understand the language. So if you or I hear the word postulate, we kind of go, that's an interesting Scientology word. Yeah. They just don't notice it. Diane Lake, who was 15-year-old, who was recruited and raped by Manson, when she finally wrote a book, she used the word postulate 16 times in the book. I noticed that and count that she's saying, well, Charlie told us that we had to change our postulates. And I'm going, yeah, only two places that could come from. One is Hubbard, and the other is Aleister Crowley, which is where Hubbard got it from.
Yeah. Can you kind of explain for people what that means from a Scientology perspective when Scientologists use the word postulate?
Yeah, to make a postulate is very simple. If we translate it into Disney language, it's having a wish. And the idea in Scientology is that, and in many other groups, Christian Science, the New Thought movement, some of the Blavatsky, lots of groups believe the secret, the law of attraction, this idea that the world is happening to you because you think it. And they haven't kind of gone, there are 8 billion people in the world. They're all thinking it. So there's this thought that somehow we control the material world through our wishes, through our desires, through our postulates. And it's a really dangerous thought. I was talking with somebody who was into the law of attraction about this a few years ago. And I said, so everything bad that happens to you is your fault. It's your bad. And she said, no, that's not the same. And there's an explanation for that, but I don't remember what it is. Okay, that's fine. Good for you. So yeah, they by the time the Manson trial started in June 1970, Operation Rawhide had already been released. They were already on it, shutting the press up, stopping anybody from associating Manson with this. In Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky in 1990, I said Charles Manson had 150 auditing sessions. and nobody came after me, and nobody took any notice.
Do you think that the people that Charles Manson recruited that were part of this Manson family, did they know that it was Scientology that Charles Manson was using to control people and recruit people? Are you aware of him identifying it or just using it in that way?
The red box files say that two, Clem Grogan, and what's his name, Bruce, his surname is going from, he was convicted of the last murder of Donald Shorty Shea, and he was the guy that was sent to St. Hill. So those two were Scientologists. There's also this side story, which is that they had a second property where they were going to hide from the end days, which were about to happen any time. By the way, you need to get out of the way by 1970 because the world's going to end then. Really? And so there was this guy who was up in this mining property where they were trying to hide out, and he was actually taking people out of the family. He managed to talk them out one by one, and he was an independent Scientologist. He'd never been involved in the mother cult, but he'd done lots of stuff. He also tried to warn the cops about what was going to happen. You know, he saw
when you say what was going to happen, you mean the plan for the murders?
That he was convinced that, and there's still a little tape of him from that time where he's saying he's going to kill people. You know, he's training people to do this. And of course, Manson, you know, in this documentary last week, it's like, that was never my intention. There's no blood on my hands. That's the expression. They keep playing the tape of Manson saying there's no blood on my hands. At the same time, they say, they play a bit of him saying he killed people when he was in Mexico. So it's like L. Ron Hubbard, I had no second wife. There's no blood on my hands from those killings. Maybe from some other ones, you know.
Yeah. That blows my mind that there's this Scientology tie-in prison. Scientology itself creates these red box files to hide it. And then there's an independent Scientologist, so somebody practicing Scientology outside of Scientology, otherwise known as a squirrel by Scientology, that tried to actually warn law enforcement, be like, this guy and his people are going to kill someone. Did he also share that? And they're using Scientology.
Well, you see, of course, he thought Scientology was a good thing, and he was using, this is the weird thing, he was using Scientology procedures to get people out of the family. So he's using an auditing techniques to get people out, and was very successful. I think he got 4 people out. And just to give some sense of it, the family, about 100 people were involved, all in all, and about 30 of those could be thought of as core members. In the end, 5, 6 of them go to prison for the horrific things they did. But yeah, it shows just, you know, and you go, well, if they managed to silence the media on that, what other atrocities have Scientologists committed? You know, we know about Danny Masterson and 1 or 2 other people, but what other things have they covered up? Because everything they've been found out on, there are probably 10 things where they got away with it.
Yeah, that's true. I don't doubt that. These red box files. So these were discovered when the FBI raided Scientology in DC and in LA.
Yeah.
Which also led to 11 Scientologists, including the wife of L. Ron Hubbard, being sentenced to prison.
Yes.
So if this was discovered then by the FBI, then it's been known this whole time by the FBI that Charles Manson was a Scientologist, and that's how he learned how to control people and recruit them for his cult.
Well, they didn't put those pieces together. I mean,
because they don't understand the terminology.
Exactly.
Reading it. Oh my God! This is why it is so important for former Scientologists who are willing to talk about Scientology to talk about Scientology. Because there are so many law enforcement people in government. I mean, Danny Masterson, that trial was a good example. the first time. The second time when Claire Headley got involved and was able to explain, hey, you need to understand the terminology of Scientology and how it works. So once again, what I'm hearing is, and maybe that's why cults and why L. Ron Hubbard creates a whole nother language, because it's harder to figure out what happened. So the FBI had this in their possession, but didn't understand what it actually meant. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The first trip I made to the US, I was in Sunland in the Valley in LA, and I get 1986. I'd given a talk, and everybody had gone, and I got in the hot tub, looking out over the valley, stars in the sky, and this guy comes along, and he says, "Hi, I'm Joe Leonard. That's not my real name." And that's a great introduction, isn't it? And he climbed into the hot tub. And he said, I was with Guardian's Office of Public Relations. I am the only person who has read all of the files that the FBI took. Now, I didn't want to contradict him because I'd met the guy who in the legal department had read them all as well. But they don't talk to each other. And he said they had files about the gun carrying squad of the Guardian's Office, Branch 4. And I'm going, what? He said, yeah, but when they were told to kill somebody, it'd be you'd R245 them,
which is pew pew, right?
Routine 245, using a Colt 45, a method of exteriorization frowned upon in this time, from the book Creation of Human Ability. When he gave the lecture, Hubbard fired a shot through the floor of the stage, and a method of exteriorization frowned upon. So shooting people. And Hubbard did give R245 orders. He published them on the cover of the Auditor magazine against the Anderson inquiry in Victoria. He said Scientologists should perform R245 on them. I'm happy to say none of them were shot dead, and I don't believe there was foul play in any of their deaths ultimately.
How did L. Ron Hubbard get away with putting in a publication out for public consumption a literal hit on people? Is it because, again, he used his own terminology, R245, instead of pew pew?
Yeah.
Is that how he got away?
Very much so. That if you create a separate language, then it just becomes too baffling. I mean, there's almost no academic work on Scientology. Now, this is really weird, because Scientology, I shouldn't say this, but it's endlessly fascinating. I was 19 when I got involved. That's 50 years ago. I've done a lot of other things. There's a book about terrorism at Oxford University Press that I contributed to behind me. I've worked on a lot of subjects which are all around cults, authoritarian groups, and what is politically dangerous in the world, not mentioning any names. I've written about, college hazing, all sorts of things. But I come back to Scientology and go, there is no other story like this. This is an incredible story. Why is it that grad students aren't doing their doctoral dissertations on this subject? Well, we're kind of stuck. And it's like, here's this thing. I was able to write about Scientology, and still, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky is the only comprehensive history of Scientology, which is ludicrous. By now, there should be tens of books. Tony Ortega's added to it. Chris Owen has added to it. They've done good historical things. I'm sure Chris Shelton along the way will make more contributions. But a comprehensive history of the whole movement, of Hubbard and what he did, you'd think there'd be, there are 50 books about Manson. Why aren't there 50 books about this? There are the books about Scientology are ex-member books, which are virtuous and very, very helpful. And there are now probably about 200 of them out there, describing people's personal journeys. But you have to connect those things together to understand what Hubbard was actually up to. And you have to go a step beyond that, which is, how does it work? Which is the question that we're beginning to get to here. What is it about this thing that convinces people that this is the way, the truth, and the life, that they're going to commit to this? They're going to sell their house and give the money away. They're going to abandon their children. Sheila Chalef, who was running harassment against me for years in the UK. She actually abandoned her children in Australia to join Scientology. These children, I think she had 4 children. The oldest was 10, and she left them forever to get in Scientology. And it was only when she married my friend Oroche left that he persuaded her. She ought to be in touch with her own children.
Yeah.
That's how much people will give away for the promise of supernatural powers, or, you know, an end to their own misery, which I think is often the actual case with Scientologists, that they are unhappy, they're miserable.
Yeah.
And they think, and you can keep getting this high from auditing, you can keep getting this sense that you understand the world better than anyone else because you've got Ron Hubbard's understanding of it. But then when you get into the technology of Scientology, and you have the differentiation between the administrative stuff, which has the ethics technology in it, and the auditing. And it's difficult to find a proper term for auditing. I used to say counseling, but it's not a form of counseling. It's absolutely not a form of counseling.
Yeah.
There are a set of hypnotic procedures which will make you feel high. Very good indicators. And that you'll have a cognition. Again, this is Hubbard taking a perfectly good word, meaning thought, and instead of using the word realization, revelation, epiphany, he's not happy with any of those. He has to, reframe it.
Yeah.
Now, here's part of the trap that we're dealing with. Everything is redefined until you find yourself, you're in a little maze of words, So when Karen de Vicario was saying to me a couple of years ago that it's so frustrating saying to somebody, but it doesn't do any of the things it says it'll do. You can't communicate freely with anyone. You can't make problems vanish at their source. You still make people wrong. You won't have any supernatural abilities. You won't go exterior. None of it works. You won't cure cancer, leukemia, raise people from the dead. All claims made by Hubbard. You won't have a perfect memory, eidetic memory. You won't have a massive IQ. You won't be emotionally stable. You won't be immune to the common cold. None of these things is true. And Karen said, and then the person will say, but didn't you have any wins? So, yeah, some days I feel good. Some days I feel bad. Some days are great. The sun's shining. I feel good. Why should I attribute that to L. Ron Hubbard? Why?
Yeah.
And of course, what's actually happening is the opposite of what you're being told. You're being told that you're becoming more self-determined. You can think for yourself. No, you can't. You can only think for yourself as long as your thoughts agree entirely with L. Ron Hubbard, which ultimately became the Truth Rundown. This idea that you can actually change your own past so that you agree with what David Miscavige believes is true.
Wow.
And away we go. So that's a part of why people stay, because you've learned a language, and the language encodes reality for you. So you learn to discern reality. So if somebody says that they don't like, the color of my eyes, then I go, I've missed a withhold on you. You are nattering. You are being critical because you think I know something embarrassing about you. Well, it could just be that they don't like the color of my eyes. It could also be that if they say, I give them something to eat and they say, this tastes horrible. It's not because they're being nattering about me because I've missed withhold. It's because it tastes horrible. And Hubbard's, it's a self-protective mechanism for Hubbard. Anybody who criticizes Hubbard, well, that's because of their overts. It's because of the dreadful transgressions they've committed. It's not because what he is saying is bullshit, which I fear to say it often is. So you're being, George Orwell expressed it very well in the appendix to 1984. And I'm going to say this again, and I've been criticized for it. 1984 is the worst written of George Orwell's books. The last person who criticized me for saying that hadn't read any of the other of George Orwell's books. So, it's like Coming Up for Air is a brilliantly written book. Keep the Aspidistra Flying. He was Animal Farm. He down and out in Paris and London. He wrote really well. This is his last book. He was in desperate rush to finish it before he died. He was very ill. And so he didn't polish it properly. But that appendix, the last few pages where he explains that you can get language to the point where you can't have a thought crime. You can't think anything that opposes the state. And Hubbard refined a language that prevents you from committing an overt, that prevents you from, and I'm talking with Cyril Vosper 14 years after he left and wrote The Wonderful Mindbenders about his experiences with Ron Hubbard and Scientology. He said to me that he'd be crossing the street and he'd suddenly think to himself, did I commit an overt? 14 years after leaving, he's still got the language controlling aspects of his thinking.
Yeah, it is difficult. It is still something I even notice. Sometimes those concepts will pop into my head like, oh, it's probably because of this. And I have to go, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's look at that. And I can completely see that being part of the trap of struggling to get out of Scientology because of the terminology. And what's fascinating to me is it seems to be so much of from day one that just seemed to be the plan. I mean, even Charles Manson figured it out like, hey, I can use this to control people and get them to do things. And then it's hilarious to me that Scientology finds that out and goes, okay, we're immediately going to create the red box we're going to put the secrets in it. And then we're going to act like it never happened. It's the same thing with members. I get what you're saying about how that's so tied into why it's difficult to leave. You can physically leave, but mentally leaving can take so much more because you have to let go of those concepts. Again, just sometimes I don't get sick because I'm connected to a suppressive person. And in Scientology, that is a big thing. One, they're making up a suppressive person, potential trouble source, all of those things just totally have you trapped there. One question I had for you, John, was on when you talked about L. Ron Hubbard literally putting hits on people and calling it R245 because it was with a 45 Colt. Is that what it's called? Colt
revolver.
Yeah, the revolver. Okay. Was there a time when he stopped doing that? Or because over the years, my time in Scientology, and I don't know everything that happened, because I remember my Tony would ask, he's like, wow, do you think they'd go as far as taking somebody out? And I was like, no. I don't think they've ever gone that far. Drive you crazy? Sure. Try to get you on a 5150. Yeah. But what you're saying, I mean, with him, and no one actually did it, but Hubbard did order it.
Yeah. In the specific cases that I've looked at, I've not found anything that supports the idea of a hit. However, when I interviewed Otto Roos, who, as I say, was the only OT8 created by Hubbard, one of only 5 Class 12s, Hubbard's own auditor, Hubbard's own case supervisor, he told me that he was given an order to kill some people by Hubbard. And he was sent to a magical coven meeting in Los Angeles, sent by Hubbard, and told to kill these people. And he said he went. The coven happened. It met where Hubbard had said it would. So Hubbard was still connected to the magic world, black magic world. But he decided that it was not in his best interest to kill anybody, so he didn't do it. So yes, Hubbard did give a specific order. And I absolutely trust what Otto said. I interviewed him over a period of years and was able to confirm, his integrity in those terms.
Did Otto share what happened when he failed to execute that order from L. Ron Hubbard?
He said nothing happened. That this would have been, I think this would have been about 1968. And Hubbard just accepted that he hadn't done it. And on we went from there. Also, and he's a dangerous source, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs, Ron Hubbard's oldest son, born in 1934, became the second in command of Scientology not long after it began in 1952, around about June 1952. And for 7 years, he is the enforcer. He's the guy working closest to Ron Hubbard, who knows more about him than anything else. And he says that his father confessed to having killed 6 prostitutes.
That L. Ron Hubbard
confessed
to that. like in that lifetime, not over my whole track.
Yes.
He confessed to his son,
Yes.
Nibs. Now Nibs was that L. Ron Hubbard Jr.?
It was, yes. Rhonda Wolf, as he was also known later.
Yeah. Do you think that was true or something that Hubbard just said? Because he said a lot of crap.
He did say a lot of crap.
Why would he admit to his son that number one, if you're killing 6 prostitutes, doesn't that means you're having interactions? I guess you could just hunt them down, but I mean, why would he admit that?
I think that his son was the only person that he groomed, and I believe there's a differentiation. I've had the privilege of seeing Nibs's final manuscript. I'm told there are only 4 copies, and I was given one of them with the understanding that I won't share it with anybody, which I haven't done. But it.
Can you mail it to me? I mean, he's deceased now.
He's deceased, but there is contention. He signed a contract giving all the rights in his work to Scientology. He was paid off. He signed a deal with Ben Corridan to co-write a book, which is the book L. Ron Hubbard, Madman or Messiah. And 6 weeks after signing the contract, he was given a substantial amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, for a silence contract and an agreement that everything he had written would belong to Scientology. So there is some contention about the ownership of this manuscript. And there is a general feeling that Nibs was unreliable. He twice signed statements of perjury. And so there's this feeling that he's unreliable. I was in touch with him back in '84. He was a fascinating human being in many ways. And my thought is, if he says he witnessed something, he's telling the truth. Mm-hmm. If he says his father told him something, he's telling the truth that his father told him it.
Yeah, exactly.
And now he believed it. And he says he did learn the magic, which is what Hubbard was really up to.
Was Hubbard saying that he used magic to kill these, I'm assuming, women?
No, he was saying he'd murdered them.
Wow. And why did he want Otto to kill the people in the coven?
I think that there were certain links that he had with the...
And when you say coven, I almost got to back it up even more. A coven is a
group of witches or magicians.
Okay. And L. Ron Hubbard
Sabbath coven.
Wanted the Scientologists to go get rid of them.
Hubbard had maintained certain contacts with the magical world. It's difficult to know to what extent, but I think he felt threatened. Anybody who has studied Aleister Crowley's work in depth, I've had to study it in depth. So Scientology used to say he's got lots of Aleister Crowley books. It's like, yeah, because Hubbard had lots of them. I can't stand Aleister Crowley. Last week, I had a friend digitize some of my recorded interviews, and I'd forgotten all about this interview I did in 1984, I think it was, with John Simons, who wrote The Great Beast about Aleister Crowley, and he was Crowley's literary executor, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, the bastard, he knew I'd do the job, but he knew I bloody hated him. So it's really weird. I'd forgotten I'd actually recorded this conversation. But there we go. The Scientology is a derivative of Crowleyite magic. It comes directly from Crowleyite magic. So certain of the concepts, like the birth engram, you'll find that in Crowley. The what they now call beginners training routine 0, but when I got in and was being told you mustn't have misunderstood words, it was called operating Thetan training routine 0. This is the first thing you do. We give you half a dozen misunderstood words before we get going, because then you'll commit overts, of course, because if you've got misunderstood words, so it just doesn't fit together somehow. But beginners TR0, that comes from Crowley. The fundamental idea.
Wait, that comes from Crowley, like the actually sitting down and doing training routines, sitting across from each other.
The beginner's TR0, where you sit with your eyes closed.
Yeah.
That one Crowley has as an exercise. He would also have had Tratak, which is where you sit and look in somebody's eyes. That's a traditional meditation. It goes back
What
centuries.
was the purpose of that as far as Aleister Crowley and black magic goes, of doing those training routines as we knew them in Scientology? But you're saying L. Ron Hubbard got the one where you're sitting there with your eyes closed and then even eyes open from Aleister Crowley. What was Aleister Crowley trying to do with that? Like, what
Well,
was the goal?
the purpose of Scientology and the purpose of Crowley magic are the same, but the word is changed. The word that Crowley used is thelema or thelema, and that is the phrase "do what thou wilt" should be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will, which is the whole statement of Crowley belief, which actually is copied from the French novelist Rabelais, but we won't get into that because it's just not safe, is it? There are too many rabbit holes here. So the idea of Crowleyite magic, and indeed of any form of magic, is that you are honing your intention so that the universe will do as it's told. Right? This is their conceit, that they believe that they can summon gods and angels and beasts and elementals and make them do as they're told. So what you're doing, Hubbard changes the word thelema, which would be translated as will, do what thou will, and gives us the word intention, which is the core word of Scientology. And what you're doing with training routines is you are refining and honing your intention. You are focusing yourself so that you will be able to command and control another person. And which is the whole purpose of Scientology, controlling others. Or give me your money, as it's also known.
Yes, that becomes very evident. It's fascinating to me because I grew up with Scientology. So it's all that I knew. I thought the whole world was like that. The ideas, the concepts weren't foreign to me. It's the only thing that I knew. I'm fascinated by too, like when, when people learn this, where they've lived a life and joined Scientology as an adult, and you at 19 you joined Scientology, but you start learning these concepts, but they're not presented like, oh, by the way, this is black magic from back in the Aleister Crowley days. It's all rebranded, it's all packaged differently, it's put out as it's this self-help thing. But these the true roots of Scientology are so dark that it makes sense to me that, of course, from that would come L. Ron Hubbard, Charles Manson, Keith Raniere. I mean, just on and on and on.
Werner Erhard,
Neil Gaiman.
Neil Gaiman most recently. Yeah, how awful is that?
Yeah, that it's just, of course. And the really sick thing about it to me is part of that trap is because that there are things that were helpful to people. There were things they found helpful or they wouldn't have stuck with it. And those things that were helpful were usually things that were found elsewhere. That
there are always things that are found elsewhere. There is nothing original in Scientology. Having spent 40 years taking it apart, I can take you to the root of pretty much every idea and where he got it from. He also perverted ideas as he went along so that he lessened their value. He himself says that you should always look to the origin of an idea, and I agree with that. Sometimes the ideas are completely spurious. Fundamentally, what happens is confidence boosting, if you want to take it down to nothing. So it's like somebody says to you, look, count to 10 and jump in. Then you jump in. And Scientology is a way of counting to 10 and jumping in. So and people, I mean, I became, I suppose, quite a forceful individual, not as a consequence of Scientology, as a consequence of being harassed, as a consequence of having to appear on TV and on stages. I learned how to say, no, this is me. I'm confident. I'm fine. I don't get stage fright. I'm perfectly happy to talk to however many people, which is weird. But that means that I learned the technique of confidence. And Hubbard himself explains in my Never Believe a Hypnotist paper, which is both on my website, and you can listen to me reading it out if you want on the YouTube channel. I don't see why anybody would want to, but there you go. That he says that all hypnotism is confidence, and that's all life is. That if you get to it, that you like, do it, grab hold. let it go.
Yeah.
Scientology can help people do that. So can anything else. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Aborigine, anything you go with, there'll be somebody there who can boost your confidence and get you to do things. In terms of, let's then talk about Scientology and the analysis and evaluation of problems, where you get something like the Data Series Evaluators course, which I did. And that was a long time. And here you have the most incredible system of logic. And when you look at it, I'm sorry, it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's this guy, and he gives clues in there. He says that to achieve the doingness of something, all you have to do is assume the beingness. And the example he gives is, if you go to a railway station, you want something to happen, pretend that you're the station master. Exert the beingness. And so when I remember reading that in the course room and going, so he's pretending to be a philosopher.
Yeah.
And he was useless. He was a useless photographer. He was a useless filmmaker. He was a useless musician and composer. I mean, get on the road to freedom. Come on, people. You know, there was an evil being. He had to hide.
Oh gosh, I
Who are we
remember that
talking
one.
about? Yeah, he spent his life in hiding. He was crap at stuff. You know, he was overweight. His breath stank because his teeth had rotted in his head. He was a multiple drug abuser. He was an alcoholic. This is a guy who smoked 100 cigarettes a day and wished he could give up and founded Narconon. You kind of, the contradictions are just overwhelming here. You know, why would we follow this person? Well, we follow him because he takes over our internal reality control. Now, this is my friend Christian Sturko, and you can find a great video we did about this. His model is what a cult is doing, what an extremist authoritarian sect, those are the words Christian uses, is doing, is taking over your internal reality control. So you assess the world around you in the terms given to you. So if you're a Christian, you may have been brought up to think that polyamory or polygamy or polyandry, you can have any three of the polys that you want, that they're wrong and bad. And so if you then meet a Muslim who has 4 wives, or you meet a woman in Ladakh who's got 4 husbands, you know, this can cut both ways. It's wrong because your internal reality control says that's wrong. It dictates to you your morality and the judgment you make of others. So if somebody else is doing that for you, there's something badly wrong. And if they're claiming that you're becoming more and more self-determined by agreeing with them more and more and more, by not thinking for yourself less and less and less, then they've got you. You're going to live in the world they create. And as you say, and I think this, I have to underline this twice in red, if you grow up in that system, it's so different to being recruited. Put the microphone back on. If you grow up in a system, it's so different to being indoctrinated in it later. And sometimes you'll find, I mean, it has happened to some extent in the ex-Scientology community. I've seen it in the ex-Mooney community and elsewhere. Born-ins can feel hostility towards recruits. So you get a little group saying, well, you don't know what it was like because we were born into it and it was much worse. And then you can get a division between kids who were born into the Sea Org and kids who were born to public Scientologists. And the kids who were born into the Sea Org, oh, that's just the most awful thing. The stories that come back from that is we should have every sympathy for people who had that problem. It's a very good book called Escaping Utopia, which I have right here. Try to keep things where I can reach them. Which is Carla McLaren and Janja Lalich, growing up in a cult. And they give a very short book as well, which is always a good thing, I think. They give a very good explanation of the differences. If your whole way of interpreting reality comes from what you grew up with. So, you know, if you bang yourself against something, you do a contact assist. Of course you do. You don't even think about it. Now, contact assist it just doesn't make any sense. You know, I've bruised myself. I will keep touching my finger against this until the bruise goes. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Until the pain goes. It doesn't. You're just doing something that is based upon a weirdo idea that L. Ron Hubbard had. You know, when he starts talking about neuron synapses and stuff and all that, and he obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. When he talks about penicillin, poor lad, he doesn't know what he's talking about. When he talks about gamma rays in All About Radiation, and Wikipedia will tell you this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But he gets the Reader's Digest, and he has an idea, and he writes a bulletin about it. And that's the great wisdom of the world. This is a man who didn't read interesting books. He read Pulp Fiction, books about hypnotism, books about magic. He was not an academic. He was not a scholar of any kind. And he takes some little idea, steals some little idea from somebody. Now, how do you make something persist? This is a question in Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard explains, if you want anything to persist, you have to add a lie. So what did L. Ron Hubbard do to the ideas he stole from other people? He added lies to them.
Yeah.
He changed them, and he made them sound as if they make sense, but they don't. When you know,
with that confidence.
Yeah.
What you were saying earlier, with that confidence, he always spoke with such authority, and all of his lectures and the films and all of it. It was, you know, growing up, it was like that was the word.
Yeah. He was, you know, a living messiah, a Buddha. And like all of the great gurus, he was full of shit. He was, you know, as I say, he couldn't take a good photograph, you know, despite having done the Kodak Eastman course on photography, which is where he got most of the study tech from, I'm told. The music, oh, come on, you know, the power of source, or puss, as one of my musician friends used to call it in Scientology. His poetry, oh no, you know, anybody wants to laugh, go and look up the Dianetics jingles, L. Ron Hubbard at his peak. But Himavasha, you know, I talked with John Sanborn, who published Himavasha. He published everything from 54 to 78. John Sanborn was on top of it, was the guy doing it. And he said Hubbard brought it to him in 54 and said, hey, I've written this poem I want you to publish. And John said he looked at him and, oh no, what am I supposed to do with this? And eventually, 20 years later, he realized that if he changed the first line, he could just about get away with it. Because the first line of that poem is, I am Maitreya. I am the future Buddha, the last Buddha, the Buddha who will liberate all of humanity into Nirvana. When Maitreya dies, there will be no humans left. We will all have entered Nirvana. So I'm guessing that he wasn't. And what John Sanborn realized after 20 years was he could rewrite the line, am I Maitreya? And put a little bit of humility into it. Yeah. And so we get this nonsensical claim, this, and oh, is he full of them? I found something, I found this last night, and I've just, it's not that I hadn't seen it before, but I've just got to read this. For anybody that wants to think, you know, L. Ron Hubbard was the wisest being who ever lived. This is Routine 3, Heaven. It's a Hubbard Communications Office bulletin of the 11th of May, AD 13, after Dianetics 13, in 1963. And it was broadly distributed. And he says, well, I've been to heaven. Now, this is, bear in mind that this is completely compatible with Christianity. You can be a Christian and a Scientologist. I have been to heaven, and I found that Scientologists have been to heaven, and that everybody has evidently been to heaven. The goals problem mass implants, which are the apparent basic source of aberration and human travail, which began with the goal to forget, were cynically done in heaven. So he says it was complete with gates, angels, and plaster saints, and electronic implantation equipment. So there was a heaven after all, which is why you're on this planet and were condemned never to be free again until Scientology. So you can be a Christian and believe that. But this is the bit that made me smile. The first time I arrived, and the moment of the implant to forget was dated at 43 trillion 891 billion 832 million 611 177 years 344 days 10 hours 20 minutes and 40 seconds from 2.5 minutes past 10 p.m. daylight Greenwich time, May the 9th 1963. So there's a piece of date locate for you. And it's just that lovely thought. This man is saying, yeah, of course you can be a Christian and do this. And heaven is a cynical forgery where you were implanted. Oh, and Christ, there was no Christ, of course, which we get to. And this is taken as, this man is thought to be sane.
Mm-hmm.
He's just sat down and worked out what he was doing 43 million years ago to the second.
Yeah.
And
John, how many people do you think around him, when you think about even with L. Ron Hubbard, his physical state, right? His teeth were rotting. He had bad breath. He was overweight. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day. All of those things. How does no one around him early on just say anything? Or did he just get rid of them? Because most people in Scientology today were given a very sanitized version of who L. Ron Hubbard was, how Scientology came about. It's a completely different story from the actual truth.
Oh, yeah.
Which makes it all more believable. But is it that the people who knew the truth are just gone? And within Scientology, like, do you think that David Miscavige, he must know all of this? Does he know all of this?
He knows some of it, but he had a brief experience of Hubbard himself. He was 17 when he joined the film crew. And of course, those wonderful technical films that L. Ron Hubbard made over that period, not one of them is in use. The films that L. Ron Hubbard made and wanted to use, not one of them. Mark Headley has interesting stories about working on those and how they just had to can them all because they were rubbish. Yeah.
They were so bad, but nobody said anything. Like, nobody was like, hey, let's run a brush through your hair. Hey, let's get you a haircut. Let's cut your nails. Hey, how about a dentist? I mean, he had tons of money. He could have hired personal trainers, chefs. I mean,
he did hire a chef. He did hire a chef.
He did hire a chef. I know.
Yeah, I hope that's helping a little in these terms. And he had his shirts made in Savile Row. And he had handmade cigarettes, Picoons from New Orleans, and Black Swans and Aberdeen Angus Bulls and a full-scale racetrack, all and 2,000 camera pieces, according to a press release to the Rocky Mountain News. 2,000. That's a lot of cameras.
Wow.
In terms of him as a person, what seemed to happen was that people would become bewitched, enamored, enthralled by him. So,
like Charles Manson.
Yeah, like Charles Manson. Well, and that kind of charisma, it's really interesting because, so if you roll back to the start of Dianetics, he spends 3 months in the company of Sarah Hollister, who bigamously is his second wife and the mother of his daughter, Alexis Valerie, who's born in March 1950. She's there. She's very smart. She is a very well-read, clever person. He's got Dr. Joseph Winter, who is a medical doctor, and he's got Don Rogers. These three people will work with him in the 3 months that lead up to him writing Dianetics. Along the way, he's got John Campbell Jr., who is actually a guy with a degree in physics, unlike Ron Hubbard, and is the editor of Astounding science fiction magazine, which is very influential, sells a huge amount of copies. It's the beginning of modern science fiction. And he's got Art Sepos. Art Sepos is the head of Hermitage House Publishing, which is a medical publisher. So what happens with these people, these 5 people who are his closest confederates? Okay, so Sarah divorces him, alleging that he's tortured her. that she's deaf in one ear because he's ruptured the eustachian tube by striking her. He runs off, steals their 1-year-old baby, runs off to Cuba with the baby, writes back to Sarah and says, if you carry on with your divorce, I'm going to chop Alexis Valerie into little pieces and throw her in the river. This is attested by Richard DeMille, who was with him by this time, but that's the next thing. So she's gone by 1951.
Yeah.
John Campbell Jr. is gone. Art Sepos withdraws the book Dianetics as fraudulent and commissions Dr. Joe Winter to write a book called A Doctor's Report on Dianetics, which is very interesting, where Winter says, I think Dianetics is very interesting, but we need more research. But Hubbard is a charlatan. So you've then you get Richard DeMille as his assistant, the adopted son, blood nephew of Cecil B. DeMille, who made Ben-Hur, biggest name film director in the world at the time. So he travels with Hubbard, and sure enough, after a couple of years, don't want anything more to do with you. Althea Hart in 1953, and on and on and on. What happens is that Hubbard is elevated. He goes from being the founder of a therapy and with psychologists backing him. In fact, Carl Rogers said nice things about him. Fritz Perls, Gestalt said nice things about Hubbard. But he attacks these people. Anybody with the word psych in their name is evil. He alienates himself. If you talk to people, and I did, who were with him in the 50s, he's a human being. He's a flawed human being. That's the way they see him. The most common comment was he spent money like water. He just was so incredibly extravagant, which is why the first 5 foundations went bankrupt, because he'd spent all the money. Then the next lot went bankrupt because he'd spent all the money. And he keeps registering one business after another. And as he says, when people have committed overts, they have to leave. They have to run away. So you see him going from Elizabeth, New Jersey to LA, to Cuba, to Wichita, Kansas, to Arizona, to Washington, D.C., to London. He just keeps on moving because he has to leave because he's committed so many overts. Terrible bad man. Nobody stays with him. Don Rogers leaves in 1954, having been on the board of all of the foundations. And when I interviewed him, remarkable guy, he wasn't upset with Hubbard. But almost everybody he said, I'd got what I wanted out of it, and I left. But almost everybody I went to, they were bewitched by him. They thought he was wonderful. And then they saw things that really scared them. With the creation of the Sea Organization, it's as if he had become a god.
True.
So if you look at, we've just released a talk with Hannah Whitfield on my channel, which we did 10 years ago, and she was with him in 1965. She, of course, would be the first master at arms in the Sea Organization, the first ethics officer. And there's this kind of awe that he starts to build around himself. And you get this thing in the inner circle. My friend Steve Hassan talks about the influence continuum. The closer you are to the center, the more involved you are. And those people all have horror stories about Hubbard, awful things that he did, like putting Felice Green's 4.5-year-old son in a chain locker for 3 days on the ship, which is a despicable bit of child abuse, act of child abuse. The overboarding, throwing people into sewerage in the harbors, in the harbor at Corfu. That he does these horrific things, and they have to protect him and make sure that nobody finds out about it, because that will damage the reputation of the technology. And so the people around him, so Miscavige saw the Screaming Tyrant, because by the time he made the tech films, which is the last time he's in a group of people, he is completely tyrannical. When I interviewed Harvey Haber, who joined Hubbard's crew over the rainbow at La Quinta, making the films, his job on the first day was to open the shutters on the windows in the barn where they were filming, the sound stage, as they might have pretended it was, to let, to get the air conditioners working again and all of this. And when he had to do it when Hubbard yelled cut, and Hubbard yelled cut, and Harvey just stood there transfixed looking at him. And the first words that Hubbard spoke to Harvey Haber were, "What effing idiot has done this?" And as I watched Harvey telling me this story, and this was November '83, it's one of the first people I interviewed who'd been, close with Hubbard. I'd only left the month before.
Mm-hmm.
There was a glow of pleasure over his face at being abused by Ron Hubbard. And I'm kind of going, this is not the kind of guy I want to follow. I want somebody who's compassionate and concerned about people. He's a raving maniac. And the stories about what happened at La Quinta, there's testimony at the Clearwater hearings from Adele and Ernie Hartwell who worked there. It's just, he was a ravening monster as a human being. And he was considered to be superhuman and allowed to get away with it. He'd have a messenger with the next cigarette for him because he couldn't breathe without having tobacco smoke. That was a necessity. So, because he came from the planet Markab, I think. And there'd be one with the cigarette and the lighter. There'd be one with the ashtray, and there'd be one with the chair. And one day, a director's canvas chair. One day, the messenger with the chair didn't put the chair down as Hubbard started sitting down and landed on the ground. That was 2 years on the rehabilitation project force.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Like, what? This is the man who's going to save humanity? It's like, oh, no.
Yeah. And so people around him from the beginning, either they would be gone or they were covering up for him because they thought they had to protect this technology because they still believed that Scientology was going to do everything that L. Ron Hubbard said it would do.
Yeah.
So it sounds like even going into the 80s when he was in seclusion and like when David Miscavige started to be more involved, do you think that they were really, because I remember I was a teenager then, knowing that no one knew where L. Ron Hubbard was, but we were always told that, well, it's because he was working on this confidential research. And then you find out later after you leave Scientology that he was, doing a lot of drugs. He was mentally unwell. He was completely not in good shape. But there were people who knew this, who were around him, who covered it up. Like, there's no way that Pat and any broker wouldn't have known.
And Serge Fouth, who of course has, spoke to Lawrence Wright and is recorded in Going Clear, where Hubbard is suffering from dementia, most definitely. And he turns to Fouth and says something that he said often over the years to other people, that he's failed completely. None of it works. It's all bullshit. And will Serge develop an e-meter that will kill him? So he's begging to die. He's done. We know from the coroner's report that he's on the psychiatric drug Vistaril. We know that he's had an episode. His alcoholism has affected his pancreas. That there is a myth of David Miscavige which needs to be dispelled. The idea that Miscavige took over at this point. Miscavige did not take over until after Hubbard's death. Miscavige did not see Hubbard. As you say, Pat Broker would come out and meet, and they'd go to, Jesse Prince did a confessional on Miscavige, which he talked about again at, I think, in Toronto. And he said Hubbard ordered a confessional. And he said
on David Miscavige.
Yeah, he said Miscavige was crying when he came in the room. And one of the things he confessed was they were taking money out of Ron Hubbard's bank accounts, he and Pat Broker, and they were going to Las Vegas and buying hookers and gambling using Hubbard's money.
What? Okay, hold the phone because this is new to me. So you're saying that David Miscavige, when L. Ron Hubbard was still alive, was siphoning off money from L. Ron Hubbard's account to go to Vegas with Pat Broker?
Yeah, whoring and gambling, yeah.
Whoring and gambling.
Like any ethical OT, of course.
I need to process. I wonder if that has anything to do with why, and for those who might not know, Pat and Annie Broker were the two Sea Org members that were directly with L. Ron Hubbard towards the end. And we were all told that they were the ones that L. Ron Hubbard was putting in charge of Scientology. I've always wondered why. Is Annie Broker still alive?
I don't know.
But
Annie Tidwell. Yeah.
Annie Tidwell. But Pat Broker was followed. David Miscavige had Pat Broker. Oh my God, that's probably why. Oh my God. I've always wondered, why would you pay $30,000 a month to have one man followed who doesn't even pop his head up? David Miscavige had Pat Broker followed, right, for like decades.
24 years at a cost of $11 million.
$11 million. He was probably
but there was tax exempt, so they didn't have to pay any tax on the religious monies that we used to harass Pat Broker. Yeah, Pat Broker, and he'll forgive me, I hope, was L. Ron Hubbard's drinking buddy for the last 6 years of Hubbard's life. He was the link to the outside world. Annie Broker was probably running the household. You know, she has a pretty good reputation, smart woman. Pat, not very smart. And so, yeah, there's this idea, and there is something more in this, which is that the last will and testament of L. Ron Hubbard was notarized by David Miscavige. But David Miscavige was never in the room with L. Ron Hubbard.
With L. Ron Hubbard, no.
After 1980. So it was a forgery. And the document that said that his body needed to be rapidly cremated is also a forgery. So there is still this possibility that Ron Hubbard was murdered. What we know is, in January 1986,
because he was in such bad shape, and he was in bad shape, not well.
He was in awful, terrible shape. As I say, he lapsed into dementia somewhere around about 1983. You get the first report of a conversation with him by an outsider saying he didn't know what day it was anymore, and he could have had, and a proper examination wasn't done. He could likely have had Lewy body dementia, which is sadly what Robin Williams had. And with Lewy body, you have fits of profound fear and paranoia. A dear friend of mine had it. And then you're completely lucid again.
Mm-hmm.
So you move between these states and you have no recollection of the paranoid state. And, you know, it gradually takes over. So he had some form of dementia. He was no longer functioning properly. The paranoia, the way that in 1982 and 83, Ron Hubbard destroyed Scientology, you know, the destruction of the mission holders network, which was where all the recruits came from, because of the paranoia that the Guardian's office were joining up with the mission holders and were going to take Scientology from him. It was none of it true. It was not happening. And I did, you know, the guy that was trying to make it happen was Alan Walter. And I did interview him along the way and, you know, various of his cronies. Very interesting man.
So get back to how David, who might have murdered L. Ron Hubbard.
The reason it might have happened is I was approached in January 1986 by the Sunday Times in London, biggest newspaper in England at the time, and they were tracking Hubbard, and they'd assigned their lead journalist Russell Miller to find Hubbard, and this was going to be a big story. And what we found, he died a week after. You know, his death was announced by Robert Vaughan Young a week after, on the day the Challenger went up. And what we were told, what Russell found out, what we were told was that in fact the FBI knew where he was and they were preparing warrants. Now at that time, David Miscavige's job at that time was, he was the head of the All Clear unit. The All Clear unit was to make it all clear for L. Ron Hubbard to walk down the street without anybody hitting him with a writ. By the time he died, he had 300 pending legal writs against him. You know, pretty much the situation that David Miscavige now finds himself in. Yeah. So their fear was that if he was arrested and there was a perp walk where people saw demented guy. I mean, even by the photographs we have of him in Queens in early 1973, he looks as if he's away with the fairies. You know, he's got a big lump on his head and his hair's all over the place. And people who saw him, Jesse Prince saw him at one point in the 80s after he'd gone into hiding, and he's just, you know, completely disheveled.
That would explain how he got so disheveled if he had that going on with the dementia.
Yeah. And, you know, he couldn't look after himself anymore. He was drinking a huge amount, so I'm told. And so there was the fear that if he was put out in public, if Scientologists saw the state of this man, that could cause defections, and defections means a loss of money.
Yeah.
And the governing policy of Scientology, and indeed the governing policy of any decent religion like Scientology, is make money, make more money, make others produce us. And it's the policy letter called the governing policy of Scientology, make money. That's what it's about. So there is this inference that it was in the interests of David Miscavige and Pat Broker to off him, to withdraw his medicines or give him a little bit too much of something. There is that possibility. I am not making that allegation. Though David Miscavige isn't going to sue me because he's never going to go into a court of law in his life.
It makes sense, though, because it would solve a problem, and it would also explain why David Miscavige notarized L. Ron Hubbard's will, last will and testament, with a change in there that his body was to immediately be cremated.
Yeah, you've also got, as far as I know, the last valid will was 1981, and in that will, a friend of mine saw it. All of Hubbard's assets were left to Roanne Hubbard Horrocks, his granddaughter. And just in case anybody from the Office of Special Affairs in Scientology is watching, some years ago when I talked with Roanne about this, she told me she has no interest in pursuing anything to do with Scientology, having been
leave the girl alone, Scientology. Let her live her life.
Yeah, in prison for the first 34 years of her life, 27 of them without contact with her mother, and just evil and appalling. But it meant that the will could then be moved to fund this body, Church of Spiritual Technology, and $500 million, $500 million is sent to that organization, which will be controlled by David Miscavige.
Oh my God.
So why does John Travolta stay in Scientology? Let's answer that question. In 1982, I think it was, John Travolta gave an interview with Rolling Stone in which he said that bad people had taken over Scientology. He was gone. He didn't want anything more to do with it. I talked with somebody who was there when he had his last auditing session before that interview, and he actually climbed out of the window to escape. Right? This was where John Travolta was in 1982. Don't want anything more to do with it. I was told that what happened after that was, there's one place in the world, well, there are two now because there's the White House. There's one place in the world where you're not allowed to be gay, and that's Hollywood, because the prejudice against the homophobia in Hollywood is still ludicrous. And so somebody went to John and said, you don't come back, you don't recant, we're going to tell the world you're gay. Which kept happening anyway, and who cares? You know, I mean, good luck to him. Couldn't care less. But that may be why he stayed. In terms of Tom Cruise, and maybe Karen Black, Priscilla Presley, on and on and on, that it becomes a system in which you function. It becomes the water in which you swim. And with the celebrities, I think the answer to that is in Leah Remini's excellent Troublemaker, where she talks about Tom Cruise having this little retinue of Sea Organization people that he can be a little L. Ron Hubbard towards. He can be a little tyrant. And I think probably a lot of Hollywood stars behave this way. I don't think it's exclusive to Scientologists. I think, you know, Jack Lemmon was said to be the only nice film actor in the world, anyone with manners. I'm sure some of the others have. But they're insulated against reality. They're they're treated as really special, super lovely beings. And in return, with Cruise, he invested himself so deeply that you couldn't work on a Cruise movie without reading Dianetics. All of the crew had to read it. The movies are done in clear sound. You notice at the end of them, which was the supposed Hubbard system, not actually developed by Rowan Hubbard any more than the e-meter was. He inflicted Scientology upon people to such an extent that I think it was a piece in Premiere magazine in about 88, somewhere around there, where they're saying that just people just didn't want to work with him. He was the highest paid actor in the world, and people didn't want to work with him because he was such a bully and a tyrant. But I mean, I'd forgive him everything for Magnolia. That is just such a brilliant film, such a great performance, where he acts as a horrible cult leader, and does it brilliantly.
Yeah.
So their egos are pandered to. They get incredible treatment. They're love bombed all the time and flattered. Then you get, say, the Chick Corea situation where, Chick Corea is undoubtedly one of the great keyboard players of the generation. He's an incredible piano player. I personally, with my taste, I wish he'd stayed with the piano. I don't like it's not that I don't like synthesizers. If you give them to Joe Zawinul, that's fine. But Corea was a brilliant pianist, really exceptional, in the same kind of league perhaps as Keith Jarrett. And yet there is something about his music that's vapid and thin, which is the kind of, we are pretending to be enthusiastic sort of end. There's not enough Sturm und Drang. There's no redemption. There's, but brilliant. And some of the pieces like, the album Bliss or Three Quartets, they're just beautiful. And yet he was ruined financially by applying Scientology to the extent that he went bankrupt. He lost his Mad Hatter Studios, which Scientology tried to prop up. So it can be that Scientology needs you so badly, they can't lose you. Seeing Priscilla Presley's bizarre statements about her own daughter, that's like, how could you feel such things about your own child? It shows that somebody is enmeshed, and the way they're thinking, or Trish Duggan and Bob Duggan, $360 million.
Yeah. To Scientology.
Yeah. And now, of course, she's at the Kennedy Center, determining the culture of America with her interesting glass casting process. And part of America First, part of the Donald Trump retinue.
It's amazing. I need to grab some of these questions here.
You better, yeah.
Letty, paralyzed to paralyzed. I know. I'm seriously like, I am so effing disturbed right now.
I'm glad to have been effective.
Right now, I love talking to you, John, but sometimes it's just like,
sometimes you screw my head up.
This is too fucking much.
It is too much. It is too much. No doubt.
But it's good. And we have to have these conversations, and we are going to keep having these conversations.
We are.
Because, I mean,
whether people like it or not, we're going to keep having these conversations.
Like it or not.
Yeah.
I've been out of Scientology for 15 years. And every time I talk to you, there's something that I did not know, which makes so much sense. It puts a lot of things, these pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But the more pieces of the puzzle I put together, the more I'm realizing this picture is morbid.
Yes.
And it's horrific. And it's so much worse than anybody ever thought. The experiences that like I had in Scientology with my family, that family members of mine had, were horrific. The experience of other people that I know and the abuse that occurred. But when you put it all together, it's just so much worse. So Paralyzed to Paralyze has a question. Is it true e-meters were found at Spawn Ranch? I don't know what that is.
Spawn Movie Ranch was where Rawhide and the Marlboro Man commercials were filmed there. And it's where the Manson family ended up. And yes, it is true. There was a guy a journalist who visited and found that they had an e-meter there. So go figure.
Wow. Again, where the Manson family was. Feral Cheryl just has a comment. This one time at Burning Man, I went clear in 2004, fully exteriorized with full perceptions.
It's the right
Snooky,
place to do it. Yeah.
yes. Snooky says, John, your book, Sell Them a Piece of Blue Sky, was integral in my willpower to leave. Thank you both.
I'm delighted to hear that. That's what it was written for. Yeah.
That's amazing, Snooky. Tim Greenglass says, Theta Clear sounds like an acne medication.
Let's patent it immediately, you and me.
You
can be Theta Clear completely. Just smear L. Ron Hubbard on your face.
No kidding. Ms. Calico 33 says, hey, finally get to see two of my favorite ex-Scientologists together live at last. Morning from Oz all. Hey, Ms. Calico, morning to you.
Yeah, good morning to you, and thank you for communicating.
Yes. Adam Carmona says, John, please hurry up with the Manson book. O'Neill's chaos is fast becoming gospel in the public mind. Yeah,
it's weird. I mean, you see video I made about O'Neill, and I read it through, and he absolutely has no evidence, and he admits it. It's just some kind of hunch. And the work that I've been, the book I'm about to publish is about Madame Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, L. Ron Hubbard, and Heinrich Himmler. And how ideas that in fact come into Scientology came out of Blavatsky through a guy called Franz Hartmann, who is a founder of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Crowley group. So these ideas go one direction into the Nazis and the other direction into Scientology. So there are many amazing things yet to be discovered, which surprises me. Then you get so what I found out in looking at Blavatsky, at Franz Hartmann, at the List and Lance, the people who gave the Aryan race theory to the Nazis, Himmler, what these people do is they imagine something and they believe it's true. And when you see Madame Blavatsky talking about, well, the universe started as a kind of fog called Fohat, fire mist, and things gradually solidified over hundreds of millions of years. And the first intelligent life was actually ethereal and lives forever. And then it solidified and solidified and solidified. And then you get some really crazy things. That was 250 million to 300 million years ago, by the way. You get to this point where she's talking about the evolution of mammals. And the evolution of mammals derived from humans. They evolved downward. So mice are the descendants of humans, and so are apes. It didn't happen the other way around. And you kind of start wandering into this, and you go, well, how do you know that, Madame Blavatsky? And she says, oh, I know it, And Hubbard, all of these people.
Confidence.
Yeah, confidence, exactly. My certainty in my thoughts. O'Neill is the same.
Yeah, I'm just going to assert this as fact, even though I don't know for sure. That is such a key piece. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a theme. Everything you've been talking about, even with Charles Manson and L. Ron Hubbard, it's this crazy confidence in which they assert themselves and what they know to be true, even though there are things that can back up that that's actually not true.
Yeah, and of course, since Blavatsky published in 1888 Secret Doctrine, there is so much evidence that's arrived scientifically that says you're talking absolute rubbish. The idea that there were millions of years of aerial warfare on the planet that she puts forward, and of course they're not aeroplanes because nobody had built one yet, so they were all dirigible balloons back in the day. Millions of years of aerial warfare, and there is not a single trace of this. Now, if you've walked any of the battlefields, Gettysburg, Bull Run, or the battles of the Civil War here in the 17th century, you will find to this day, or if you go to Belgium, to Flanders Field, you will find ammunition. You will find bits of human bone. You will find things. These were wars in every case, actually. All three of those wars lasted 4 years. So wars that lasted for millions of years would have left something behind. There would be some bones. There would be some little bits, fragments of metal. There's nothing.
But she says it with such confidence.
Yeah, and then they predict the future. So L. Ron Hubbard with I want Scientologists to survive World War III. which was what, 1977 or something. I once Scientology, and I interviewed a guy who was on the Watchdog Committee. They're ruling, the 14 people ruling Scientology directly for Hubbard. Forget the executive director international or the president. They're way down the line.
Before David Miscavige threw them all in a double wide trailer.
That's the stuff. So this guy's on the Watchdog Committee. There are 14 of them. It's 1980, and they get an advice or order, as we call it, from Hubbard, which says it's too late. The world's gone. I'm not going to be able to save humanity. I can do no more than save the 14 people reading this directive. And at that point, the guy I interviewed left. He said, if it's just going to be these 13 people I'm stuck with, no thanks. I'm going to go and die with my mum and dad and my sister. But this confident predictions about what is going to happen, you know, L. Ron Hubbard, optimistically, we have 5 years left, which was, I think, 1965. Just, they make all of these predictions, and yet we follow them, despite the fact that what they say about the past is nonsense, and what they say about the future is nonsense, and what they say about how we work is also nonsense. So, you know.
Wow. Let's see here. Does it matter to you? Not to me. I love I love this one-on-one. John's knowledge is so in-depth. It's crazy. We need more of this.
Thank you so much. There is more of it.
There'll be more.
We can't help ourselves. We enjoy it too much. Right. But it is an incredible subject. You know, most things in half an hour you can find out what there is to know about it. Scientology is just infinite.
Well, and that is the problem. Like you were saying, there are not enough people outside of Scientology doing studies and writing about it. That's why I think it's so important to have these conversations. YouTube is a wonderful platform because it will be here and it'll be there for people to be able to watch and understand and hear all of this, because you know, some people like to read books, some people like videos, some people do both, but it's where we can reach an entirely new audience with this and help people understand. I think this is Phoenix Book Girl says, could you ask if he ever recorded audio? This is you, John, his other books on Audible, but cannot find Blue Sky anywhere. Thank you.
Yeah. About, I don't know, 3 years ago, Aaron Smith Levin said to me, well, you know, I'm not going to read Blue Sky, but if you make an audio book. So I went off and I'd already made an audio book of Opening Our Minds. And I thought it would be easy because I like reading out loud, but it was really grueling. So I'd done that. And so I thought, well, look, to satisfy Aaron, I'll read my shorter book. Where's it gone? Got a copy of it somewhere. Which was actually, it was a lecture I gave to 200 priests. And the thought was to write something for people who've never heard of Scientology that tells you all of the really gory details. And it's quite short. So I read that out and I got hold of Aaron and I said, you know, I've done this. And he still wanted me to, he wouldn't, no, I want Blue Sky. You know, it's 420 pages, people, you know.
People want Blue Sky on Audible.
It might happen. And I think there's also there is a thing that our culture is moving more towards listening to things and reading things.
Yeah.
And I think that because Scientology's study technology really screws with people's ability to read. So many ex-Scientologists do not read books because they've just been, oh God, I've got to look up every word, or I've got to do this, that, and the other. And so getting back to the point where that's okay. You know, I'm still a big fan of books. I don't use audiobooks at all. Yeah. So there is another question in all of this, which is, you know, I should be 70 years old this year. And I was meant to retire. The retirement age in this country is 66. And I can't because I have to earn money because my pension is not sufficient, because rather than being a good and diligent person, I wasted my life talking to people who needed help and didn't have any money. And so of the 600 people that I've talked with directly, 3 of them gave me any money. Everybody else. So I find myself in a situation where I need to make some money. If somebody would sponsor me to spend the probably 2 months it would take to make an audiobook of Blue Sky, then I would do it with pleasure. But at the moment, I have to finish this book, which is called If Scientology Ruled the World, Nazi Occultism, Sex Magic, Space Aliens, and the Second Coming. So there should be an audiobook of that, because it's shorter than Blue Sky. So I should be able to manage that. I also, I'm talking with Claire Headley at the Aftermath Foundation about doing a course for former members, because this stuff doesn't just evaporate. It stays, I've talked with people decades after they left, and they still had fixed ideas and patterns of behavior that come from Scientology. And the frustrating thing is, it's not that difficult to undo them, but you can't undo it yourself. Yeah. My involvement with Scientology, I wasn't traumatized and abused. That really helped. But I decided I wanted to know everything. So the history of the movement, oh my God, 150 people contributed one way or another their stories to Blue Sky. Blue Sky was the basis for the biography of Hubbard, Barefaced Messiah, and I was the only hired researcher and the expert witness in court for that book. They still stand as the history of Scientology, my partial biography of Hubbard in Blue Sky, Russell's brilliant biography in Barefaced Messiah. But beyond that, I said, well, but how does it trap people? How do people get involved? I got into the whole psychology of that, and I went into, I read about 100 other cults, maybe more, understanding what is common between these things. As I have written about terrorism, where you find the same. If you look at the Al Qaeda recruiting manual, it's like the Moonies or Scientology. It's the same stuff. Oh, find something you agree about with the person. Find their reality. It's right there. So finding out how systematic this is and how it's done. And so I'm proposing a 4-part course, but I'm going to need funds to do this, because I want to
and here's John's. Oh wait, this is the website.
Yep.
Oh, wait, I meant to pull up your
the YouTube channel.
The YouTube channel. So
that has the Patreon on it, and
here is it pulled? Wait, no, I got to pull that up here. John, you got me so messed up. I can't even work my own buttons anymore. I'm like, seriously, I can't even think straight right now. Let's see, where's your YouTube channel? Here it is. Did that come up? You can find it. Yeah. So, and all of this is linked in the description of this video. So you guys can follow John here on YouTube. I linked to his book. Everything is linked down below. And we're going to set up another time sooner than later to continue talking about these things. Because you're right. There's not one place, and there's so much that is where do you start? I've been thinking it would be so great to have a playlist that kind of breaks it down. And just from my videos I've done with you, I think I'm going to do that and do a playlist of some of these things where people can just go right to it. You want to know about how Charles Manson was a Scientologist? Here. You want to know about how L. Ron Hubbard said that he, killed a bunch of prostitutes over here. It's just, there's just so much. There's so much. And again, if I'm overwhelmed by it, I can't even imagine people just out of Scientology. It is a lot to take in. You leave Scientology and you're like, okay, that's, whether you acknowledge it as a cult or not at that point, you just know you don't want to be there. Then you move away from it and you learn other ways of being. But then so much of this is it's unknown. And I try to remind people about that, especially people who are live streaming or protesting at Scientology locations. The everyday Scientologists don't know this. They're not sitting there knowing this and just going along like nothing has happened. They don't know.
Yeah, it took me 7 years after I left to be confident that I could sit down with pretty much any Scientologist and in a single day persuade them that they needed to rethink their involvement. I've never sought to dissuade somebody from practicing Scientology if they want to. I got into this thing with Apostate Alex the other week, and he's saying, and it's understandable, he's opposed to the beliefs of Scientology, but if people want to be Scientologists, that's fine. I'm going, well, It's not the beliefs, though, is it? Scientology is a set of practices, and those practices are damaging. So
yeah, it's the abusive practices.
yeah, but I wouldn't seek to stop somebody from hypnotizing themselves or what have you if they want to. But that it's a very specific thing. People would come to me. I had a brief career, 4 or 5 years, doing interventions for people back in the early 90s. And everybody I talked to left Scientology. Nobody went back. Nobody carried on in the independence. But I would have to say at the beginning to the person who was hiring me to do that, I'm not here to talk your brother, sister, son, grandpa out. I'm here to offer them information they don't have and see if they would like to change their mind. Where it goes from there is what we all want is to be able to make our own minds up. And when you realize the extent to which that process has been influenced by Ron Hubbard, or indeed by anybody else, including me, then these are dangerous things. And I do believe that everybody is capable of thinking. I do believe that everybody is capable of making their own mind up. But there are so many tricks and traps. And part of that is how you present it. So if I go along and say, look, I'm John Atack, I've written this book saying how awful Scientology is, how many Scientologists are going to listen to me? None.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Your first stage is, how do you sneak the material in? And that's, I've been working on how we can do that. So the material is not in any way tainted. It doesn't, it is just L. Ron Hubbard material with nothing else added that is enough. If you see the contradictions between these things, a friend of mine said, oh, but Clambake's already done that, John. And I'm going, yeah, how many people are curious about their involvement in Scientology? You're going to go to a site that's called Clambake about.
Yeah, they're not going to go dig through all, different forums and thing as well.
Yeah, so it's got to be something that's presented to them.
Yeah. Jake over at Altworldly. Good to see you, Jake. Do you all find Jake, for those that don't know, over at Altworldly, he is a former JW and he does an awesome channel doing similar to what I do here. So if you guys have any interest in the JWs, absolutely go over and follow Altworldly. And he has a question. Do you find all that the in real life protests against Scientologists end up driving them further in? I'm going to give my opinion. I want to hear yours then. I think it depends on the person and it depends on the protest, because there are former Scientologists. Tori Magoo is a good one, who there were protesters who said things to her in a very kind, simple way that stuck with her and kind of got her wheels turning. Like, if you're free, why can't you read anything that you want to read? So in my opinion, it depends on the style of protesting and that individual Scientologist. I feel like many of us people got in for different reasons, and they'll leave different ways.
Yeah, this is true with Tori, who's brilliant. I love Tori. Tori Chrisman, Tori Magoo. She was actually working for the Office of Special Affairs, harassing people online. Yeah. So the person who she contacted was Andreas Heldel-Lund, who saw some of what she was saying. Andreas, sadly, no longer with us, but a brilliant, lovely guy. I loved Andreas. Just absolute perfect Asperger's genius. He was just lovely. But he and I had the great privilege of being there when they finally met in Toronto 10 years ago, because they both came to the thing I didn't, and they'd never physically met. And what happened was that he started saying, oh, you're using all caps, that's considered shouting. And he started talking with her, and she developed a relationship. So that was a personal thing. There's a video on my channel, which I did with my friend and assistant Spike, called Why We Don't Protest, which seeks to answer that question very thoroughly. I think that, say, the anonymous protests, where there was one in London where there was a KFC or something, and you've got 200 people standing outside your organization going, chicken, 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 cult, cult, cult. I don't think that helped anybody leave.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
On the other hand, what we're seeing with the Tesla protests at the moment, and I've been saying for more than 10 years, do it this way. Get the WISE directory, the World Institute of Scientology Enterprises, find the businesses that are making money and two of you go and stand outside the headquarters of the Duggan Empire or whatever and hand out a leaflet to everybody that goes in that says, this organization sponsors slavery. Because it does. Because the organization, there are 4,000 slaves. So I think pinpointed protests. Was it Sebastian, the guy in LA that became a TikTok legend by going out and talking to the protesters? So it actually promoted Scientology. Apostate Alex Barnes-Ross, who's a friend of mine, and I support his activities. But he and I crossed swords because the week before his protest a couple of years ago, Spike and I put this video out. And he's like, why didn't you get in touch with me and say you're going to do it? It's like, it wouldn't have made any difference, Alex. These things I need to say. And what actually happened with his protest, and I can see the positives that he and Tony Ortega see from what happened there. But until their protest, the Daily Mail had put out, which is the world's most read newspaper, had put out an article saying Tom Cruise had left Scientology 3 months before. This meant that their crew were actually there filming because of the protest, and they saw Cruise's helicopter landing. So the world was told he's still in Scientology. So, and I was on a protest in 1983, marching to St. Hill with the mad Captain Bill Robertson and his lovely signs, freedom, not greedom, and auditing, not frauditing. And I handed a petition to Warren McShane, who shoved me. But it sort of, I think we want to communicate with people. And if I was inside an organization and a lot of people were outside shouting, it would make my belief, it would strengthen my conviction. It wouldn't weaken it. So I think putting things out there that are friendly and, which the Aftermath Foundation has most certainly tried to do, great respect for them and their endeavors. But with Aftermath, they're focused very much on helping Sea Org people get out, which somebody has to be. But Sea Org people don't have the internet.
Yeah.
So putting stuff out there that it'll be safe for people who are still involved to look at, rather than the kind of hate fest that is so often what's happening now. Who hates who in the ex-Scientology field? It's like, oh, come on, just get over it.
Not on my channel.
Yeah, no, exactly. And not on mine either. It's not. And that's why I first came to you, because I saw you saying that you weren't going to get in the middle of the thing between Jenna and Aaron. And I went, good, this is somebody I can talk to. I don't want any of that. I'm very, I've never stopped talking to Aaron. When I was on Aftermath, I was still talking to Aaron. I'm not going to get into it. It's not for me to make judgments about people.
Yeah, especially when there's so much of this information that can help so many people. And it's bringing that awareness also for people never in Scientology, but all in on ending this cult. I feel it's very empowering for them. Some of them have been involved with high control groups in similar situations, and some light bulbs might be going off. And a beautiful thing that the protest does do is, I think it goes a long way in preventing people from joining Scientology in the first place. And with the internet today, with the internet and being able to live stream and having little short things about it, there's Aaron at Growing Up in Scientology shared on a video the other day that his kids are even seeing things about it. They're learning about it on TikTok more than watching his videos. Everybody has their different thing that they like to follow it and watch. So I always feel that any way people can get out information and whatever they're passionate about. Some people have a focus when it comes to sharing about wanting to expose the abuses in Scientology. And I think it's going to take all of it. It just is. It's going to take all of it. And anything anybody does or can do to help move that needle forward is a beautiful thing. And I'm so appreciative of it, especially from people who were never in Scientology, but again, are all in on ending this cult and raising awareness about it and empowering people, because Scientology is going to go away. They've been dying for years, but there are other cults. There are other high control groups. There will be other Charles Mansons in the world. And I think this also goes a long way in inoculating people against that.
Yeah, and it's going a step beyond. This is what Scientology did to people. into this is how Scientology did this. This is why it works. When I wrote Opening Our Minds, my focus was completely on what are the methods that are common to all authoritarian groups,
Yeah.
and none of this is taught in our schools.
Mm-mm.
The closest I've got, a couple of years ago, I was asked to go and talk at Eton, the most prestigious school in the world, which was incredible. It was a real buzz going to this place where 21 British prime ministers went to that school.
Wow.
Unbelievable. The most, the Duke of Wellington went there. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet, went there. George Orwell went there. That was great. And what I wanted to be able to launch from there, and I was working on at that time when I was invited, was a course for schools. And I don't have the resources. I don't have the money and I don't have the time. I do know how to do it. And it is something that's taken me 50 years to learn how to do. And
Yeah.
it's so frustrating that there is no program to teach children. And I've been approached again and again by people who want me to produce a free program for kids. And there's just too much work to do and not enough of me to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And people, you said on your YouTube, there's links on there where people can contribute if they want to contribute financially, to support what you're doing.
You've got PayPal me, John Atack and Friends, right there.
Oh, right there. Okay.
In the little blue writing on the screen.
Yeah.
And and by becoming a patron, what the reality of the YouTube channel is 6 years now we've been running it. And so far, my total cash return in 6 years is 0. We are still paying for my assistant Spike to spend the day a week that she spends on putting videos together. So it's not proved to be profitable, but it has helped a few people, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that it's helped a lot of people, and that's why I love having these chats with you. But we have to wrap up, John.
We do have to wrap up, John. It's time John was wrapped up.
I'm gonna need a shower. I don't know. It's just so
to
much.
Wash all the body thetans off you. Yes.
You dropped a lot of bombs.
Yeah, that's it.
I actually feel right now like I could turn and throw up in the garbage. It is, but it's so important. And we are going to continue having these conversations, even though they make me want to crawl out of my skin sometimes, just finding out more of the truth. I so appreciate that you're willing to do this and share this, because you are a wealth of information. Everybody, make sure you head over and you follow John Atack there. It's also linked in the description of this video. Please hit like on this video and subscribe as well. John and I are going to go talk about our next date to get together and do this. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody else. I hope you get out and have an amazing cult-free day.
Yeah, have a lovely time.